Hello, everyone. It is day 42 of our quarantine, and today we are diving into music history, and we are going to start back as early as we have record of with the Middle Ages. So, the Middle Ages is the period that's over 1,000 years. It starts from about 450 and goes until about 1450. So that's starting about when the Roman Empire collapses and Europe is purged into what we call a dark age. There's a lot of migration, there's upheavals, and there are a lot of wars. But out of this time comes a time of cultural growth, with towns and universities being founded and a huge amount of construction within the church, building churches, monasteries, and cathedrals. In fact, smack dab in the middle of this period is when Oxford University is founded. It is important to know that during this period, we have three distinct classes of people: peasants or common folk, nobles, and clergy. So if you can imagine, during the medieval period, the European landscape is mostly farm and forest. And you can imagine that these cathedrals would really draw your attention, draw your focus. These cathedrals were also the focus of education and music. Most clergy were also musicians, and it's here that we find our first written music. Some of the earliest choir music was written for a convent of nuns by Hildegard Von Bingen. At this point, most music is written for the voice, and instruments are only used as accompaniment. This changes around the year 1100 as the church starts to develop instrumental music, primarily the organ, though much of the clergy at the time did not approve. Apparently, they used to try and crank the organ so loud that they could be heard for over a mile away. At this point, the official music of the Roman Catholic Church has been what we call Plainchant and then Gregorian Chant. In these chant styles, it is just a melody with text in Latin. There is no accompaniment. There was also not exactly rhythmic notation. So the notes were written and there was some rhythmic indications, but we think they mostly learned these rhythms by rote. So legend has it that the Holy Spirit sat on Pope Gregory I, also called Gregory the Great, sat on his shoulder in the form of a bird, probably a dove, and whispered the melodies to him. Though scholars don't agree because the timeline doesn't really line up. The timeline has Gregorian chant really emerging around Pope Gregory II, not Gregory I. What we do know is that before Gregorian chant, there were regional chant styles, and those chant styles were all kind of lumped together as Plainchant. And the big innovation of Gregorian chant is the use of these strange scales that were described as having otherworldly sounds and became known as the church modes. Do you remember when we talked about those way back in our scale video? So, we know that outside of the church, music was also being performed. Art depictions is one of our best sources of knowledge on this. Most of this music was probably never written down, but in the late 13th century, we have some French troubadour music that is preserved. Most of these songs are about love and the Crusades, but there's also some that we think are dance songs as well. There's still not true rhythmic notation, so really the rhythms of these troubadour songs are anyone's guess. I think it's important to note that we know for a fact that in this time period, women were composing. For the time, Hildegard von Bingen's music was very innovative, and she might have even written the first kind of predecessor to a musical theater type piece. Though at the time, females were not allowed to sing in church. They would have been singing in the convents, so nuns would have been singing in the convents, but it's likely that a lot of her music was never heard by much of the public. We also know there were female troubadours in the south of France. We have some written music by Beatriz de Dia, who I might have pronounced wrong. And we know that her songs were addressed to men. I think it's interesting that though at the time females were not permitted to sing in church, which would have been the biggest source of music, in the music history book that I use as a reference, there's 3 composers referenced: Pope Gregory I, Hildegard Von Bingen, and Beatriz de Dia. Pope Gregory I probably didn't actually write it. So the 3 composers referenced were female. Next video, we're talking about Renaissance music. See you then.